Imagine standing at the edge of a precipice where faith meets the cold edge of a blade. In Argentina, they often ask a question that sounds like a joke but carries the weight of 1,000 years. Who is more important, Lionel Messi or the Pope? It sounds trivial until you realize that both represent the same thing, the ultimate icon of a nation's identity and soul. But centuries before the world knew of football or modern papacy, the question of importance was settled not with goals, but with blood, iron, and a cross stained red by the sands of the Middle East. We are entering the final, darkest chapter of the Crusades, a time when the dreams of kings turned into a nightmare of shadows and assassins. By the late 13th century, the holy fire that had driven Europe eastward for 200 years was flickering out. The 7th and 8th Crusades had been catastrophic failures. King Louis IX of France, a man so pious they called him a saint, had led 2 massive expeditions only to die in the heat of Tunisia, leaving behind nothing but charred remains and broken promises. But as the French crown retreated in shame, a new player stepped onto the board. Across the English Channel, the fires of resentment were burning. England and France were like brothers who shared a house but dreamt of each other's funerals. They were locked in a perpetual dance of spite, and Prince Edward of England, the future Longshanks, could not stand to see the French glory, even in defeat, overshadow the English lion. Edward did not wait for a papal decree or a holy summons. He gathered a small, elite force of 3,000 men and sailed for the Holy Land. It was a move of pure ego and desperate chivalry. He arrived in a landscape that had already forgotten the smell of victory. The Mamluks, the warrior slave dynasty of Egypt, had become a juggernaut that no European steel could stop. Edward's arrival was less of an invasion and more of a nuisance. He struck at the outskirts, winning skirmishes that meant nothing in the grand tapestry of the war. He was a shark in a bathtub, dangerous but ultimately confined. The Mamluks looked at this English prince with a mixture of boredom and irritation. They didn't need an army to stop him, they needed a shadow. In the dead of night, a man draped in the guise of a friend entered Edward's chambers. He claimed to bring messages, perhaps even a treaty. But hidden within his robes was the ancient tradition of the hashashin, the assassins. As Edward leaned in, the assassin struck. A poisoned blade found its mark, slicing into the prince's flesh. It was a moment that should have ended the Ninth Crusade then and there. History tells us Edward survived, some say because his wife sucked the poison from the wound, others say through sheer, stubborn English will. But the message was clear, the Holy Land was no longer a battlefield for knights, it was a tomb for interlopers. Edward limped back to England, his crusade a footnote of failure, leaving the last remnants of the Christian presence to rot in the sun. The year 1291 marked the true end of the world for the Crusaders. The city was Acre, a fortress port that stood as the final jewel in a shattered crown. Within its walls were 10,000 defenders, a mix of broken soldiers, desperate civilians, and the legendary warrior monks, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. Outside, the horizon was swallowed by 60,000 Mamluk warriors. The air didn't just vibrate with the sound of drums, it screamed. The Mamluk Sultan didn't just bring men, he brought the most terrifying siege train the medieval world had ever seen. 200 massive trebuchets, engines of wood and tension, were lined up like gods of destruction. They began to rain fire and stone upon Acre, a relentless bombardment that turned the sky black. Inside the city, the atmosphere was one of suffocating dread. For every one catapult the defenders had, the Mamluks had 10. Along with the trebuchets came 150 ballistae, massive crossbows that fired bolts the size of spears, pinning men to stone walls before they could even scream. And then there were the battering rams, 50 of them, massive trunks tipped with iron, crawling toward the gates like prehistoric beasts. The defenders watched from the ramparts as their world was systematically dismantled. There was no rescue coming. The sea was their only exit, but for the Knights Templar, the sea was a path for cowards. The code of chivalry is often romanticized, but in the ruins of Acre, it was a suicide pact. Attack! As the walls finally groaned and collapsed, the Mamluk tide poured into the streets. It was a slaughterhouse. The screams of the dying were drowned out by the roar of collapsing stone. Those who could flee scrambled for the harbor, piling into small boats, desperate to reach the safety of Cyprus or Europe. But the Templars stood their ground. They retreated to their fortified compound, the temple, and prepared for the end. When the Mamluks offered terms of surrender, the Templars looked at the blood of their brothers on the floor and chose eternity instead. The Grand Master of the temple did not beg for mercy. He spoke of a faith that could not be burned out by fire or broken by steel. He reminded his men that they were not fighting for a city anymore, they were fighting for the memory of what they were. When the Mamluks finally breached the compound, the structure itself collapsed, burying both the attackers and the defenders in a tomb of limestone and gold. With the fall of Acre, 2 centuries of the Crusades vanished. The Holy Land was gone. The cross was pulled down from the towers, and the crescent was raised. It was a total, humiliating defeat that changed the psyche of Europe forever. But history is rarely a straight line. While the Crusades in the East failed, the spirit of the conflict didn't die, it simply migrated. On the Iberian Peninsula, the Reconquista was raging, an 800-year war to reclaim Spain and Portugal from the Moors. This was a crusade that actually worked. It was more brutal, more personal, and far more successful. It was here that the white slave trade flourished, where the cycle of revenge between Christianity and Islam was honed to a razor's edge. The victories in Spain provided a psychological balm for the losses in Jerusalem. It was from this hardened, militant Catholicism that the explorers of the next century would be born. When Spain and Portugal eventually sent their ships across the Atlantic, they weren't just looking for gold, they were carrying the ghost of the Crusades to the New World. Think about the irony of the modern religious landscape. Why is South America, a continent thousands of miles from Rome, 70% Catholic today? It is because the fire that failed to capture Jerusalem was redirected toward Mexico, Peru, and Argentina. The sword that broke at Acre was reforged in Toledo. This is why the question of the Pope versus Messi carries such weight in the streets of Buenos Aires. One represents the cultural triumph of a faith that survived its own destruction, while the other represents the modern idol of a nation born from that very struggle. The failure of the 9th Crusade also planted the seeds of the Renaissance. As the Knights returned from the East, they didn't just bring back scars. They brought back the lost knowledge of the ancients. In the libraries of the Arabs, they found Greek texts on philosophy, medicine, and mathematics that Europe had forgotten during its long, dark sleep. They learned of the concept of zero, of advanced surgery, and of the stars. The very people they had tried to exterminate became their teachers. Europe went into the Crusades as a fractured collection of barbarian kingdoms and emerged with the intellectual tools to conquer the globe. It was a theft of knowledge paid for in blood. But the scars of 1291 never truly healed. The enmity between the 3 great Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, was codified in the ruins of those desert cities. The conflict we see today in places like Gaza and the West Bank is not a new war, it is the echoing thunder of a storm that began 800 years ago. When Israel was re-established in 1947, it was seen by many in the region as a new crusade, a return of the Western presence to the land of the prophets. The theological war never ended, it just changed its weapons from trebuchets to missiles. The Ninth Crusade was the moment humanity realized that God does not always favor the bold. It was a lesson in the limits of zealotry. The kings of Europe learned that they could not simply wish a kingdom into existence through prayer and slaughter. They had to look inward, to build their own nations, to foster their own cultures. The 200-year cycle of the Crusades was a fever dream that left Europe exhausted, broke, and cynical. But in that exhaustion, the modern world was born. The power shifted from the battlefield to the bank, from the knight to the merchant, and from the priest to the scientist. As we look back at the 9 Crusades, the victories, the massacres, the tears, and the shame, we see a mirror of our own nature. We are a species that will travel across oceans to die for an idea, yet we will ignore the wisdom of the very people we fight. The ruins of Acre still stand, buried beneath the modern city, a silent witness to the day the sun set on the medieval dream. The Crusades ended in failure on the map, but they succeeded in defining the borders of the human heart, forever divided by walls of faith and the shadows of the past. The story of the Crusades is not a story of who won or who lost, it is a story of how we became who we are, trapped between the desire for heaven and the reality of the sword.